Hello everyone and welcome to another video on our own devices. I'm Jean Messier and today we're having a look at some underappreciated but absolutely vital pieces of First World War military equipment. These are 4 different models of British trench periscopes. Now, when the war broke out in August 1914, almost no army had any significant stocks of these types of periscopes. After all, they weren't anticipated to be needed. The war was anticipated to be this very fluid and dynamic affair of maneuver and countermaneuver over open ground. And so the only branches of the military that had periscopes were essentially the artillery and the engineers. However, by the winter of 1914-1915, the situation had changed dramatically as the race to the sea ended and the Western Front stagnated into trench warfare. Suddenly, trench periscopes became a vital piece of equipment, and this became especially true when the Germans introduced snipers to the battlefield, since any soldier that dared stick his head up above the parapet for even a second or two was likely to be gifted with a shiny new orifice. Now, unfortunately, as I mentioned in my video on Galilean rifle sights, the British really didn't have a very well-developed optics industry. Indeed, prior to the war, they sourced around 60% of their optics from Germany, 30% from the French, and only 10% domestically. And once the war broke out, of course, German optics became unavailable, and the French optics industry struggled to meet even its own needs. So there was a very severe shortage of optical quality glass. Indeed, if I might take a detour, this problem became so dire that in 1915, the British Ministry of Munitions actually struck up a deal with Germany to trade rubber from the British colonies, which was cut off to Germany due to the British blockade of their ports, for 30,000 pairs of German-manufactured binoculars. And the deal actually went through, brokered through intermediaries in Switzerland. It just goes to show how desperate each side was for those particular resources. So what this meant was that for the first year or so of the war, British industry was unable to keep up with the enormous demand for trench periscopes, and troops on the front were forced to improvise. Now, where the government fell short, private industry was more than willing to step in, and a number of British and French companies produced a variety of trench periscope designs for the troops to purchase privately. And one of the first to reach the hands of the troops was this, the Vigilant, produced by Secretin in Paris. And as you can see, this really isn't much of a periscope. It's just a mirror with a metal case and metal cover and a little swiveling socket at the rear. And this is for mounting on the tip of a bayonet, such as this pattern 1907. And you could either use this on its own, or you could mount this to the end of your rifle and stick it up above the parapet and have a look at what was going on in no man's land. Now, what's interesting about this is that the socket for it is round. It doesn't really seem to be designed for a pattern 1907 bayonet. But since this is manufactured in France, my assumption is that this was for the bayonet for the 1886 Lebel rifle, the famous Rosalie, which is a cruciform spike bayonet. Now, this is really a solution of last resort. I can't imagine you being able to see much very clearly with this tiny mirror up on the end of your bayonet, but I suppose given the circumstances, it was better than nothing. Now, a little bit more sophisticated is the Lifeguard, which was produced by a rather unexpected company, F. Dewar and Son of Manchester, who are known for making, of all things, preserves, jams, and jellies. And so if we open up this box, which is original to the unit, you can see what this looks like. So this is fairly compact. You could slip this into a tunic pocket, or this was actually sold with a khaki pouch that could clip onto pattern 1908 webbing. Unfortunately, I don't have one for this one. But then if you wanted to use it, what you would do is stretch it out, and hey presto, you have 2 mirrors. It's a periscope. So a number of companies, including Ork-Oi and Oxcentric, made very similar periscopes, and at first glance, this looks like a very clever, very handy little device. It's lightweight, it's compact, you can carry it around in your equipment, and whenever you need to sneak a peek over the top of the trench, you just fold it out, and there you go. However, in practice, these turned out to have a number of serious flaws. Number one, given the state of the British optical glass industry, the mirrors on these tended to be of fairly poor quality, giving you a very bad view of no man's land. And indeed, you can see that the silvering on these mirrors has almost completely tarnished with age. But even worse than this is the fact that this has no mechanism for fixing it to the side of the trench, meaning it's entirely handheld. And even in the steadiest hands, this is going to wobble significantly and flash light at the enemy, which is going to make you a prime target for any lurking snipers. Now, what's funny is that the companies that produce these tried to spin that bug into a feature, with Oxentric's ad reading, "All military men are demanding a periscope which is no trouble to carry and yet of a size to be thoroughly practical for trench work and scouting. It would be quite useful for heliograph signaling." Now, while heliographs or signal mirrors had been used to great effect on the open velds of South Africa during the Boer War, they really weren't used all that much during the First World War. And this really demonstrates how little the public back home understood of the realities of trench warfare. Now, like I said, this doesn't come with a carrying pouch, but the box did come with this envelope for a spare mirror. And those would be swapped out by folding back these metal tabs. Though having dealt with fixing mechanisms like this before, this seems to me like a surefire way to end up with a hand full of glass. Now, before we move on, just a note on this particular periscope. Dewar still exists, and in 2014, to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the start of the First World War, they actually produced a limited run of replicas of the Lifeguard periscope, though those were almost immediately snapped up, and I haven't seen any for resale. This is an original, and this was very hard to track down. There really aren't any for sale anywhere, but hopefully within a couple of years, maybe more will appear on the market. But while large numbers of these privately manufactured periscopes were purchased by the troops, private industry couldn't hope to keep up with demand, and so the vast majority of trench periscopes used by the troops during the first year of the war were manufactured on site in improvised workshops just behind the lines. And the builders very quickly learned what the optimal design features were for trench warfare. As Captain Leslie Vickers of the Seaforth Highlander writes in his 1917 book, Training for the Trenches, "Some periscopes that were brought to France were huge cumbersome boxes that made a fine mark for the enemy sharpshooters. But the kind that was most generally used after the first 6 months of the war was that which consisted of a stick with 2 slanting grooves in it, one near each end, into which grooves small mirrors could be fitted. We found them quite effective, and should an accident happen and a mirror be broken, they were easily replaced from the store we carried with us for that purpose. Not having a box of any kind, they were difficult to see from the enemy lines." So, by late 1915, British industry was finally starting to catch up with demand, and officially issued trench periscopes started reaching the front in large numbers. Now, one of the most commonly issued models was this, the Adams No. 9 box periscope. Now, unlike the other periscopes in this video, this is not an original, rather this is a fully functional replica that I built myself, though it is accurate in nearly every detail. Now, as the name implies, this is a simple box made out of wood with 2 45-degree mirrors at the top and at the bottom. This is hinged in the middle with a clasp here so that it actually folds in half, so it can be stored in a smaller carrying case. And you have a pair of little hinged doors that allow you to access and swap out the mirrors. So while this might look rather crude for an officially issued piece of equipment, this actually incorporates a number of design features that speak to the lessons learned over a year of trench warfare. For example, this spike at the bottom here allows you to stake the periscope into the trench wall, preventing the mirror from wobbling and attracting attention. And this would preferably be done under the cover of darkness so the enemy didn't see you moving around, and rarely would these periscopes be mounted on their own. Typically you would cover the top with burlap or sandbags or mud or other types of camouflaging material to hide them from view. And there are reports of even more clever uses of camouflage. For example, on a number of occasions, troops found a shattered tree or stump out in no man's land, and in the middle of the night snuck out, replaced it with a chicken wire and paper mache replica with a periscope fitted. And so a soldier could sneak out and you would have a forward observation post that was closer to the enemy lines. So the number 9 periscope was also deliberately made wide enough so it could be used with standard field glasses or binoculars, providing much needed magnification. Also, the viewport here was fitted with a glass screen, which I didn't fit to my replica, as well as this sliding metal shutter. And that was meant to be opened just as wide as you needed to see whatever you were observing. And that is to protect the viewer's eyes, because if a sniper were to hit the top of the periscope, the broken pieces of the top mirror would fall down the box, bounce off the mirror at the bottom, and straight into the viewer's eyes. So they learned very quickly that you needed this type of protection. Now, by 1917, British industry was finally able to produce large quantities of high-quality optics, including periscopes that were optimized for trench warfare. And this is one of them. This is a Periscope Mark IX manufactured by R&J Beck Limited. This was mainly issued to officers, and as you can see, this has a very low profile. This barrel is only about an inch in diameter, which makes it very difficult for the enemy to spot when you poke it up above the parapet. It doesn't make it invisible, though, and the poet Robert Graves wrote about having one of these, and the first time he stuck it up over the trench, a German sniper immediately destroyed it with a shot from 400 yards. Now, unlike previous models that we've looked at, this isn't simply a tube with two 45-degree mirrors in it. This has a number of optical elements inside in order to give the viewer a clear and magnified view of the battlefield. And you can even adjust the focus of the eyepiece by twisting it as so. So I'm actually going to partially take this apart and show you some of the components inside. Right, so if we remove the two little screws at the top here, we can pull the head off. And if you tilt the barrel, out comes this little spacer. Now the bottom here is cut in an interesting pattern, and I haven't found any literature indicating what that was for, but I have two different guesses. One is that this is supposed to be a spring to protect the insides from shock. The other is that this is to compensate for thermal expansion and contraction. Now, if you look at the head itself, if we remove these two even smaller screws, we can rotate the cover away, and here we have a little retention spring. If we pull that out, we'll see the mirror itself, along with a little piece of cork to protect the mirror from the spring. However, this is probably very fragile, and given that the optics in this are in such good condition, I'm not going to pull that out. Now, going down to the eyepiece, unfortunately, I don't have the wrench necessary to open this end plate, so to avoid damaging this, we're going to leave that alone. But I can pull out these two tiny screws here, and we can pull out the eyepiece, and you can see the spiral groove in which those two set screws sit, and which allow the eyepiece to rotate when you're focusing it. And really, that's all there is to it. It's not a very complicated piece of equipment, but it is a very well-designed, a very robust, and a very effective one, incorporating a lot of the lessons learned over the preceding 3 years of war. Now, this is just a selection of the many different models of trench periscopes that were issued during the war. In fact, in the British Army alone, 31 different types of trench periscopes were officially issued, and these include the number 4 tubular periscope, which was specifically designed for use on the 2-inch toffee apple mortar. This had a 1.5 times magnification and 20 degrees of swivel. The number 25 periscope, which had 6 times magnification. And the number 26, which was a box periscope but with a metal rather than a wooden case. Now, I can't very well make a video about trench periscopes without mentioning another uniquely First World War piece of equipment, and that is the Periscope Rifle. Now, being able to see the enemy from the safety of the trench is one thing, but if you actually want to shoot at the enemy, you need to risk putting your head up above the parapet. And for this reason, nearly every army during the First World War experimented to some extent with systems that allowed you to fire a rifle or even a machine gun from safely below the parapet. And there were dozens of different designs that were patented or even built, including the Lights, the Beech, the Cameron Yagi, the Giberson, the Remington Rio Seco, and the Elder. And while these all followed the same general design pattern, they varied widely in their specific details. So for example, some models used an intact service rifle that just clamped in place. Others modified the rifle by, for example, cutting off the stock and mounting it below for the operator to use. Some had mechanisms for operating the bolt from below, whereas in others you had to tilt the mechanism down to operate the bolt. Some had extended magazines for more extended fire, but in general all had two basic features: a linkage to allow you to pull the trigger below to operate the rifle above, and some sort of periscopic sight to allow you to aim. And while some of the better designs were quite effective at ranges of up to about 300 to 400 yards, these were basically harassment tools. You weren't going to do a lot of damage to the enemy with it, but you could use it to harass them and keep their heads down. But just as trench periscopes became suddenly vitally important in late 1914, early 1915, they just as quickly became all but irrelevant again in mid-1918 as the war became once more fluid and mobile. And since trench warfare has not been fought on such a large scale since this time, trench periscopes really haven't played a major role in subsequent conflicts. So they have been used to a much lesser extent, especially in the form of rangefinder periscopes for artillery. Anyway, that's all I have for you today. Thank you so much for watching, and a big thank you to Gord Crosley of the Fort Garry Horse Museum for loaning me the bayonet mirror here for inclusion in this video. I'll see you next time on another episode where we'll look at yet more fascinating equipment just like this. Until then, I'm Jean Messier from Our Own Devices. Have a great day.